that you are well, and I also hope that you had an amazing day. All right, so for today, we're doing our grade 2 English lesson on adverbs, right? So we're doing our English grade 2 lesson on adverbs. So before we start, we're going to log into aplusstudents.ca. And once we log into aplusstudents.ca, we're going to log in with our username as well as our password and select the subject of language arts. Then we go to grade 2. All right, so once we've selected the subject of language arts, grade 2, then we're going to scroll down up until we get to the subject of adverbs, right? The chapter of adverbs. And under the chapter of adverbs, we're going to be focusing on the lessons of does the adverb tell you how, when, or when. And then we're also going to identify adverbs within this lesson. So we're going to start by does the adverb tell you how, when, or where? All right, so an adverb, right? Sorry, it's a word that tells you more about either a verb, right? So an adverb, it tells you more about the verb. And with this adverb, right, it tells you how, when, or where. So it's like you need to ask yourself how, and then they will either tell you quickly, quietly, softly, or you ask yourself when, right, and then they will tell you soon, or later, or now. Where can be outside, can be inside, can be there, right? So that is basically like how you need to answer the question how, when, or where. So with some adverb that tells us how, right? These adverbs they usually end in ly. So adverbs that tells us how, they usually end in ly, right? For example, how does she run, right? She ran quickly, right? So ly is our adverb that tells us how she runs. So quickly. And it also ends in ly, right? So this is an adverb that tells us how, right? So how does she run? She runs quickly. That is why I'm saying you need to ask yourself questions like how does she run, right? Or how, depending on whatever the sentence is. So quickly is the adverb, and we said that the adverb that tells us how, they usually end in ly. So it can be quickly, can be quietly, can be softly, can be hurriedly, can be speedily, right? These are all the words that tells us how. Then some adverbs they tell you when. So they tell you when, right? So for example, when does he leave? So then we can say he leaves soon. So you don't necessarily have to be, you don't necessarily have to say tomorrow, right? Or today. Words like soon or later or now, these can also be words that tells us when, right? So soon, when, later, now, these are words that we can also identify as adverbs because they will tell us when. So he leaves soon. So soon is our adverb that tells us when he is leaving, right? Then some adverbs they tell us where, right? So where do they play, right? They play outside. So outside is but an example of where, right? So outside or inside or here or there, those are all adverbs that tells us where, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be a specific place, right? That you now say is they are playing at, right? So where doesn't have to be like a name of a city or name of a place, right? It can be words like outside, inside, um, there, here, and so on, right? That is the breakdown of adverbs, right? So once again, an adverb, it's a word that tells you more about the verb and it tells you how, when, or where, right? And with the adjectives, it tells us how, they usually end in ly. And then we have adjectives that tells us when. It's like you need to ask yourself, when did it happen? When does it leave? Right? When must we go for whatever? Right? So when. And then we have some adjectives that tells us where. Right? So where do they play? Where is basically the answer that the question that you need to answer. Oh, sorry. I apologize. So, yes. So, basically, an adverb, right? It is a word that tells us more about a verb and it tells us how, when, or where. I apologize. Please let me know if my tone is way better. It's just that my throat is a bit sore, but I will try to project it a bit more. All right, so that is an adverb, right? In an adverb, it tells us how, when, or where, right? And most times, or usually, whenever the adverb tells us how, it ends in ly. All right. So now we are going to a few questions, right? That is based on adverbs. And we are, so they're going to basically ask, like, does the adverb tell us how, when, or where? So we're going to identify if the adverb tells us either how, right, when, or if it tells us where, right? So yeah, Megan always helps her dad. So Megan always helps her dad. So now we need to ask ourselves, does this adjective, right, does it tell us when or does it tell us where? So it says always. So Megan always helps her dad. So if Megan always helps her dad, then it is basically answering the question when. So when does Megan help her dad? It's like asking when does Megan help her dad, right? So when is our adverb, right? So it tells us when. So when does Megan help her dad? Always. She always helps her dad, right? So remember when it doesn't necessarily have to be tomorrow. We're saying what's another word? When. So it doesn't necessarily have to be tomorrow. On the 5th in August, you don't have to specifically say things like that, but you can say always. Um, she helps her dad now. She'll help her dad later, and so on. Ashley's dog always barks. So Ashley's dog always barks. We need to say if if it tells us when or if it tells us where. So Ashley's dog always barks, right? So always barks, which means that Ashley's dog always barks. It is like us asking when does Ashley's dog bark, right? So when he barks always, right? So always is our answer. which means that it tells us when this dog barks. The dog barks always. So when does a dog bark or Ashley's dog bark? He barks always, right? So when is our adverb. So it's an adverb that tells us when he barks. The fish swims quickly, right? So the fish swims quickly. Does it tell you how or does it tell you when? So the fish swims quickly. Does it tell us how or when? And remember we said that adjectives that tells us how, they usually end in ly, right? Which means that the fish swims quickly. So it's like asking, how does the fish swim? Right? So it's asking, how does the fish swim? And we can then say, the fish swims quickly. Right? And quickly also ends in ly because we said adjectives that tells us how, they usually end in ly. So adjectives that ends that tells us how, they usually end in ly. All right, we're moving on. All right, let's go next. We're going next. The sun sets early. So the sun sets early, right? Does it tell you when the sun sets or does it tell you where the sun sets, right? So in this case, they are telling us when the sun sets, right? So when the sun sets, right? So when does the sun set? It sets early, right? So it sets early. So it doesn't ask us where the sun sets, right? Over there. Nope. It tells us when the sun sets. And the sun sets early. Mr. Mr. McKnight teaches today. So when does Mr. McKnight teach? So we need to ask ourselves, like, when does Mr. McKnight teach? Right? So when does Mr. McKnight teach? Right? He teaches today. So today is our adverb, but that tells us when Mr. Knight teaches. And Mr. Knight teaches today, right? So remember we have adverbs, right? That tells us more about the verb. And these adverbs, they can either tell us how, when, or where, right? So in this case with Mr. McKnight teaches today, it's like you can basically ask like, when are you teaching, right? So when, and then the answer will be today. All right, so just to basically recap on the definition of an adverb, right? An adverb is a word that tells you more about a verb. So an adjective is a word that tells you more about the verb, right? And it tells you how, when, or where, right? So these are the questions that you basically need to ask yourself when it comes to an adverb, right? So also adjectives that tells us how, right? They usually end in ly, right? So they end in ly. Doesn't necessarily always end in ly, but yes, it does end in ly. Seth always brings his skates. Seth always brings his skates, right? We need to say, does it tell us when, or does it tell us where? So Seth always brings his skates. So it's like us asking, when does Seth bring his skates? Right? So he brings it always. So always is the adverb over there that tells us how often Seth brings his skates. All right, so now we're going to our test. And we're going to begin test. It says, look at the adverb in bold, right? Does it tell you when or does it tell you where? Does it tell you when or where? So Ashley's dog always barks. So Ashley's dogs always barks. So we need to either say if this adverb it tells us when, which is always, or does it tell us where? So Ashley's dog always barks. And we need to answer, does it tell us when he barks or where he barks? All right, so if we choose when or where, then we're going to say when, right? Because Ashley's dog always barks. It's like asking, when does he bark, right? So when. He sang well. He sang well. We need to ask ourselves how he sings or where he sings, right? So in this case, it's like asking ourselves how, right? So he sings well or sang well, right? So how he sang well. Because where will give us a different answer. Fred quietly reads. So Fred quietly reads. So does it tell us how he reads or when he reads? So we need to say if it's telling us how it reads, how he reads, or when he reads. The word quietly. All right, so the word quietly, right? It tells us how he reads. So Fred quietly reads. It's like asking yourself, how does Fred read? He reads quietly. He waved sadly, right? So sadly, does it tell us how or does it tell us where? Sadly. So it's asking yourself, like, how did he wave, right? Or asking, where did he wave? So where is definitely not the word. So how. And also the word ends in ly. All right. The science club meets tomorrow. So the science club meets tomorrow, right? So does it either tell us when they're meeting or where they are meeting, right? So which means that the question, or let's say the sentence says that the science club meets tomorrow, that is like saying when, right? So, sorry, when, right? So when are they meeting? They are meeting tomorrow. So when, right? So when, it tells us when they are meeting. All right. So those are basically adjectives that either tells us how, when, or where, right? So now we're going to identify adverbs. And once again, an adverb is a word that tells you more about the verb, right? It tells you how, when, or where. And in some of the adverbs, it tells us how, right? The adverbs or these adverbs, they usually end in ly, right? Like quickly, hurriedly, softly, quietly, right? So quickly is the word that tells us how, which was identified within that sentence. Then some adverbs that tell us when, right? So when can be soon, later, now, tomorrow, right? That tells us when. And then some of the adverbs that tell us where, right? So if they tell us where, it can either be inside, outside, there, here, right? Those are all words that um, are adverbs, right? And adverbs that tell us where. All right, so now we're going to our first question. Oopsie. It says you need to select the adverb that tells you about the verb in bold, right? So it says Pam's band played lost. Pam's band played lost, right? So a hint is when did Pam's band play, right? So when did they play? They played lost, right? So we can say lost is it's our adverb, right? So it tells us when did Pam play, right? So Pam played lost. That is when she played lost, right? Lisa's friend fell down. So Lisa's friend fell down, right? And a hint is where or how did Lisa's friend fall, right? So we need to basically first find out how or when Lisa's friend fell. But now we need to identify the adverb within the sentence. Lisa's friend fell down, right? So the word down is our adverb, right? That tells us either how she fell or where she fell. So down is our adverb. I will gladly draw pictures. I will gladly draw pictures, right? So how will I draw? I will gladly draw pictures. Gladly. So gladly is our adverb, right? And they tell us how. So I will gladly draw pictures. So gladly is the adverb, right? That tells us about the draw. All right. All right, let's go next. Lisa's friend fell down. So remember we said that down is our adverb. The science club meets tomorrow. Science clubs meets tomorrow, right? So it's basically asking when does a science club meet, right? So when do they meet? They meet tomorrow, right? So tomorrow. So tomorrow is our adverb, right? And that tells us when the science club is meeting. All right, so basically, in the sentence of the science clubs meets tomorrow, They say that the adverb is tomorrow, and it tells us about the verb meets, right? So when does the science club meet? So they meet tomorrow. All right, the next one says he waved sadly. So how did he wave? Right? He waved sadly. So sadly is a word that we have identified. So sadly. And they basically ask, how did he wave? Right? He waved sadly. Right? He was sad. Right? So sadly is our adverb that tells us how did he wave. All right. Nope. All right, let's go to the next one. Just so that we can get a more broader, let's say, examples of what the adverbs are. The red car stopped last. The red car stopped last. It's like asking, when did the red car stop? Right? So it stopped last. So last is it tells us when did the last car stop or the car stop. Carter ran inside. So Carter ran inside, right? Inside. So we need to basically ask, where did Carter run? Did he run outside? Did he run there? Did he run here? Right? So in this case, Arthur ran inside. Oopsie. Sorry. So yeah, it says where he ran inside. I apologize for that. Inside. So where did Carter run? Inside. Sorry for that. All right. Now it says the door closed loudly. So loudly. If we identify the word, the adverb within the sentence, then the door closed loudly. So loudly is our adverb and it tells us how did the door close. So in this case, the door closed loudly, right? And remember we said that an adjective that tells us how, or not an adjective, an adverb that tells us how, right? It usually ends in ly. So an adverb that tells us how something happened, right? It ends in ly and can be loudly, it can be softly, it can be quickly, it can be hurriedly, right? Because that is how it tells us basically how something happens, right? And now, yes. All right, so let's go to our test. All right, so with our test, right, we need to identify adverbs. So here they're saying you need to select the adverb that tells you about the verb in bold, right? So teaches, right? So the verb in bold is teaches. So Mr. Finney teaches today. We need to say if the adverb either tells us it basically either tells us when, does it tell us where, or does it tell us how, right? So Mr. Finley teaches today. So we need to select the adverb, right? And a hint is when does Mr. Finney teach? So when does Mr. Finney teach, right? Which means that he teaches today, right? So today is our adverb because teaches is the verb. All right, so today the kids are playing nicely. So the kids are playing nicely. We need to select the adverb that tells us about the verb in bold, right? So how are the kids playing? Is it kids or nicely? We need to select the adverb that tells us about the verb. So nicely. So which means that the kids are playing nicely. Then it also ends in ly. Lisa's friend fell down. Lisa's friend fell down. We either need to identify the adverb as down or friend, and a hint is where or how did Lisa's friend fall? Right? She fell or she falls down. Right? So down is our adverb. My team finished early. So my team finished early, right? We need to identify or select the adverb within that sentence, which is my team finished early. And a hint, it's like asking when or how did my team finish, right? So they finished early. So early is the word or adverb, right? He sang well. So he sang well, right? We need to select the adverb that tells us about the verb in bold. So he sang, right, is our verb. And a hint is how did the boys sing? So you need to basically ask yourself the question, how did the boys sing, right? And they sang well. So as you can see in this case, right, yes, it does also tell us how, but how does not end in ly, right? That is why I said usually, right? I should probably say sometimes whenever you write when if the adjective answers how, then it will end in ly. But in this case, there is no ly. It's just that he sang well, right? So well is an adverb that tells us about the verb. It tells us how he sang, which is he sang well. All right. Gabby races next. So Gabby races next, right? So a hint is when or how does Gabby race, right? So Gabby races next. So is it the first word, which is Gabby, or the second option, which is next? So races is already a verb, which means that so which means that Gabby races next, right? All right. We're gonna do one more. School started late. So school started late. We need to ask ourselves either when or how did school start, right? So school started late. So late is the the word, right? That tells us more about the verb. So if we ask ourselves when or how did school start, then we can say school started late, right? So late, and we can choose okay. right? All right, so now we go back. All right, so far this is adverbs, right? And the lessons that we focused on was, does the adverb tell you how, when, where? And we also identified adverbs, right, within the different sentences, right? And remember we said that if an adverb tells us how, right, then it usually ends in ly, but it does not always end in ly. And we even saw an example earlier on where the adverb does not end in ly, but it asks the question how, right? So adverbs, they either tell us how, they tell us when, or they tell us where. All right. So now let's go to our whiteboard. We're going to the whiteboard. It's an adverbs worksheet, sorry. So adverbs worksheet. So we need to find and circle the adverbs. We need to find and circle the adverbs within these sentences, right? So if we find and circle the adverbs within the sentence, the first one says the project goes on smoothly. So we need to identify the adverb within this within the sentence. So the project goes on smoothly, right? So it's like asking yourself, like, how does the project go on? Then we can say it goes on smoothly, right? So we will circle smoothly, right? He slowly backed his car into the garage. He slowly backed his car into the garage, right? If we identify the adverb within that sentence, right, and then you will say slowly. All right. He was painting heavily as he ran, right? So he was painting heavily as he ran, meaning that he was very busy, right? Painting either the whole room or the whole house. So he was painting heavily. So we will say heavily is our word, right? Worry kills more men than work, right? So that basically means that the more you worry, right, it will kill you more than working. So sometimes we think working is going to kill us because it is so stressful and it is so much, but they're actually saying that worry will kill more men than work, right? So basically, we either need to ask ourselves, what kills, right? So either worry kills more men than work. All right. So worry kills more men than work. So we can ask ourselves, when does it kill you? Or when, or where does it kill you? So we need to ask yourself, like, how does it kill you, right? So how? So how does worrying kill us? So worry kills more men than work. So kills is basically our verb, right? Within that sentence. Let's come back because that is a bit tricky, right? I ate too quickly and I got hiccups. So how did you eat quickly? right? So quickly is our adverb that tells us how, right? So it's the adverb that tells us how. So how did you eat? Quickly or too quickly. And that is why I got hiccups or hiccoughs. It's actually hiccups. I was curiously silent through all of this. I was curiously silent through all of this. So curiously, right? Curiously silent through all of this. She moved swiftly to the rescue. So we will then say swiftly. So how did she move? She moved swiftly, right? To the rescue. She usually sings in the shower, right? She usually sings in the shower. So usually, right? So how does she sing? Or how often does she sing? She sings usually. Have patience, the bus will come soon, right? So soon is our adverb. So soon. And it will tell us when, right? And then he sat silently in the class. He sat silently in the class. So we need to basically ask ourselves, like, how did he sit? So he sat silently in class, right? So silently also tell us how, right? And remember, we said how, um, with how, or let's say the question that we ask how, the words usually ends in ly, right? So how did he sit in class? He sat in class silently, right? So silently is basically our adverb within that sentence, right? So silently. All right. Now we're going on to the next one. I'm going to try and make this a bit bigger because it looks quite a bit blur from my side. Oopsie. All right. We need to add ly to each word to make an adverb, right? An adverb that tells us how. So quiet, we need to add an ly. So if we add an ly to quiet, then it will be quietly, right? The way the girl is sitting, she sits so sadly, right? Sadly. And then the boy is running quickly, right? The tortoise is slowly. It's like we are adding ly, right? Over here, this girl is loudly. And here, they are friends hugging kindly, right? And even here, the way the boy is running, we can say the boy ran quickly, right? Because how does he run? He runs quickly. The girl shouts loudly, right? How does she shout? Loudly, right? And here we can say that this tortoise, he walks slowly, right? So these are words or adverbs that tells us how, right? Adverbs that tells us how. And remember with an adverb, it tells us about the verb, right? So an adverb tells us more about the verb and it often tells us how, it tells us where, and it tells us when, right? So that is adverbs. So that is basically now the end of our lessons, grade two. You should have an amazing evening further. Goodbye.